And I'm looking at, are we all over 40 at least? Most of us over 50 or thereabouts. Yeah. It's kind of, what happened to Sunday school? I mean, Hannah's doing a great job, thank you Hannah, taking the kids out. Wasn't for her, there wouldn't be a new generation coming through currently. We thank you for everyone else who's been a part of that too, but it's becoming less and less the people that are hearing these stories. And I'm not preaching from Jonah today, but it's just something I really wanted to bring to the table this morning, at least part of the story. And yeah, if we've been in the church, we know the deal. So Jonah's trying to run from God. Hands up, anyone who's tried that? Yeah. Hands up, how many people have tried it more than once? Yeah? Yeah, I don't know. Ian and I, at least. Yeah, I just outed him from the back. But yeah, I just don't get why we keep doing that. Most of us have done it plenty of times, probably plenty of times in the last 12 months. But yeah, Jonah, here he was. He had a clear vision and a mission from God. Now, sometimes we can use the excuse that we weren't really sure what God wanted us to do. But in the case of Jonah, it was clear, and he knew he was meant to be going and talking to the people of Nineveh. And he didn't want to do that. There's a whole pile of reasons, we can get into that. But we just place ourselves in that position, and we know we've got our excuses, and none of them really add up. They're just excuses. But he ends up on the boat, and he ends up in the midst of a storm, although he's not 100% aware of that at the beginning. But the sailors very much are. And initially they start doing what sailors do, try to sail. And they start chucking everything out of the boat, they try and lighten it, and you know it's desperate when they're throwing the cargo out of the boat, because that's their paycheck. They're just throwing that away. In fact, they're probably never going back to the port they picked that up from, because if you go back, really sorry, but we lost everything. They're probably not going to give you another chance at that. So that's a big deal. They really are down to saving their lives. And then they find, hey, there must be a reason for this, and they start checking around and they find Jonah. And Jonah admits that yes, he's running from his God. And that really means something in those days. If we were to go, maybe to the local pub and someone said, why are you so sad? Oh, I'm running from God. And they may actually understand that, I'm not sure. They might just go, you probably haven't had enough beers yet. Or maybe you've had too many. Either way around. But yeah, these guys understood what running from a God was, even if they didn't understand Jonah's particular flavour of it. And so they thought that was pretty serious. And Jonah said, look, the only way you're going to save yourselves is if you throw me overboard. Now, I'm really surprised by their reaction in a sense, but then maybe not, if you look at human nature. But I mean, I'm pretty darn sure I would have gone, yes, you're going over. And anyone else who sort of puts up a fuss about it can go too. But it's not what they did. They did maybe what we tend to actually do, and they decided to row harder. And so they had sort of something based on a galley, it had a sail, but it also had oars. And they were kind of like, maybe the problem is not the size of the storm, or not why the storm was caused, but maybe the problem was we just haven't tried hard enough yet. And I just wanted to just bring that out of the story this morning before we get into the message itself, because a lot of us fall into the same deal, where we just go, maybe if we just try a little bit harder. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Who's heard of that before? And we often do this. And eventually they had to do what Jonah had said initially and throw him overboard. But they tried everything else first, and sometimes we're a bit like that. I know I am anyway, where the first thing I do is try in my own strength, and the last thing I do is ask God for advice. And even when I do ask him, I'm really slow often at actually doing it, because I just keep trying. And maybe it's because God steps out of our sort of comfort zone and does weird things. But yeah, I don't know why they had a problem with not throwing him overboard, because even these days, seriously, it doesn't take much to get thrown off a boat. So, but yeah, they just keep trying. So, we'll come back to that. So the title of the message this morning is actually A Wise Person Trusts God, and it's based around Proverbs 3, 5 and 7 and Proverbs 16:20. And so we'll just look at those passages. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. In 16:20, those who listen to instructions will prosper, and those who trust in the Lord will be joyful. So who's come across these before? Yeah? Yep. Yep. Who does Proverbs and Psalms as part of their Bible reading program? No? I only got 2 hands. Who does a Bible reading program? 3? Well, okay, there's a few more hands. That's good. Just checking. So yeah, it just depends. I might tailor the message differently. But yeah, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. All right, who's tripped over this one? Today, maybe. Who's not being honest? Because there's only a few hands moving. So, all right, who actually goes and seeks his will in all that we do? Yeah, not so many hands on that one, eh? That's probably the more honest approach there. No more hands. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. And I think maybe verse 6 doesn't happen so often because verse 7 does. We are impressed by our own wisdom, and so we don't run to God in all that we do. And I can remember years and years ago, and I've shared this story before, but we had a Bible study. It was when we were in a different church before our kids were born. Yeah, meeting at Woodlands Road. Must have been just after we moved. And yeah, so we were running this Bible study. It was part of a larger youth group, and we struck a bit of a problem. And it actually, in the end, we shut the youth group down because we just couldn't get around this one gentleman. And he kept bringing back that God doesn't actually have a particular will for minor details in our lives, even major things. You don't have to take it to God. As long as you're coming from basically a good person sort of point of view, good moral standing, and then God will bless it. And you don't have to check before you do stuff. And we just could not get around this. We went round and round in circles so many times, so many weeks. And in the end, we decided it would actually be easier to close that Bible study down than to continue to have this problem. And anyway, he eventually moved on to a different part of the country, and we saw him, I can't remember, it was a year, 2 years later. He came to worship back at the church where we still were, and he had his fiancée with him. I was like, I'm not going to be able to help ask him this question. So I came up to him and I said, so just out of interest, is this God's choice for you, or is it your choice? Is this the one or a one? And he goes, oh no, this is God's choice and the one that he chose for me. I said, oh, well, isn't that slightly different to what we've talked about in the past? He goes, yeah, I know. And I said, well, what changed? And he said, oh, I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. And she said, so, am I the person that God has chosen for you? And he said, oh no, I don't really believe in that. I believe that God gave me a mind and I could choose, and I've chosen you. And I could have chosen numbers of different ones and still being in God's will, but I've chosen you. And she said, well, you can come back when God's chosen me for you and when I am the one. So he went away and he had to think about his theology, and he went back and decided that yes, God had chosen her specifically for him. And he decided that God does have a specific will for his life, and a detailed will. And see, it doesn't say up there, seek his will in some of the things that you do. It says in all, and we'll get to that a bit later in the message too. So Proverbs 16:20, do you want to be joyful? Then trust the Lord. It's that easy. And probably if I was back in Roman times, you might be stoning me at that point, because it's obviously not that easy. Well, this would be the end of the message. All we have to do is read Proverbs, go, yes, that's what I should do, and go off and do it. And then the rest of life would be just smooth sailing. Yeah? But hands up, who's had a smooth sailing life? Yeah, there's no hands for that either. So a wise person trusts God, but an honest person would admit that it's incredibly hard to do so. Who finds it easy to trust God? Yeah. Yeah, and I wish I could come up with a whole lot of really simple answers to that. I'm not really. I'm going to just suggest a few things that we can do to help. But, yeah. So a wise person trusts God. The problem is not understanding that we need to trust God, but to know how to trust God more. That's the problem. And the answer, unfortunately, isn't an easy one because God builds our trust through experience. If we look at the trials in our daily lives and make this mistake of measuring them against what we think we know and what we can see instead of what God's promised, then we're going to have a problem with this trust experience. We actually have to look at things differently. You know, we have to look at the way that God is and who He is versus our problems. So I've already covered this off. You know, do we really seek God in all we do? Or do we just justify that God doesn't want us to ask His opinion on every decision? Maybe just the important ones. And who decides which are the important ones? I guess that's us as well. Do we decide that ourselves, or do we ask God that question? And you know, I've only ever tripped up in my life when I either haven't asked God first, or I've asked Him and then I've done something different to what He told me. Those are really the only two things. And the times where I've gone out and gone, you know what, I'm going to do the weird thing that He's asked me to do, it's worked out. Now that also doesn't mean it's worked out easily. So, you know, for those who don't know, we work at Christian Youth Camp now. Something I've always wanted to do. The first time I'd sort of had that thought was when I was 13. So that's been a nagging thing in the back of my life for a while. Because I'm really dangerously close to 50 now. But getting there, whilst when it happened was kind of clear, it certainly wasn't easy. And it meant giving up a lot of things. And I'm still actually learning through that giving up process, by the way. It hasn't finished yet. And you know, part of that was giving up a business and a secure income. And you know, we get paid for working there, but it's not quite the same as when you work for yourself. And there's a whole lot of things that weren't easy, but it was clear. And that's to deal with trusting God. It's often clear, it's not always easy. We often find it easier, at least I do, this is speaking from my experience, to trust God with our eternal salvation than with our finances, our relationships, our jobs, education, friends and family. Can anyone else relate to that? Is it just me? Yeah? It's kind of, I think it's because, you know, our salvation and our eternity is almost an existential thing, if I can even say it. We kind of know about it, but it's out there somewhere, whereas our daily lives are right in our face the whole time. That struggle's always with us. And we can kind of trust God for the thing we don't entirely understand, but for our daily bread, it becomes a bit of a struggle. And so that's, you know, that's our life struggle, actually. I don't think it's a bad thing, but maybe understanding that can be helpful. So what does it mean to trust the Lord, though? It certainly doesn't mean the absence of problems in life. You know, again, I could test the theory, right? Hands up, who's got no problems? You know? I mean, hands up who wants no problems? Hands up who thinks that's actually a reality likely to happen? Yeah, it's not going to happen. However, though, what is the result of not trusting God? It's even more problems, right? So this life is full of problems, but if you want extra ones, you know, it's like, I mean, who wants that? Anyone? I'm just going to keep having you put your hands up or down. You don't have to move them too much for this one, really, because who wants more problems? Don't want them to happen, yeah, but who wants extras? But, I mean, sometimes you look at people's actions and you just kind of go, I mean, did you really want that? We're just at Easter camp, and Easter camp's kind of interesting. You always get to sit down with people and download their life story. And this person said, I keep doing the same stupid thing over and over again. And then they texted me during the week and said, did it again. And I'm like, it wasn't through lack of knowledge, right? Yeah? But we do this stuff all the time, don't we? We know X, Y, Z things are bad for us, and we still do them. But the result of trusting God is definitely worse. Not trusting God is definitely worse than trusting Him. Trusting God, though, is not doing what you want and expecting God to fix up the mess. Anyone made that mistake? Yeah. God is just not going to just bless us anyway if we're not asking Him first, listening to what He says, and doing it. Risk-taking without waiting and hearing from God before acting is not the same as trusting Him. You see this in Christian ministry sometimes, where people will just go right out there and they'll do this amazing thing and it just falls apart. And they go, wow, what happened? I thought God was in that thing, or God would bless me if I was able to take a risk. Sometimes the things that God asks us to do are really risky, but make sure it's what God has asked you to do before doing it. And don't get the two things back to front. Trusting God is also not doing nothing and expecting God to do everything for you. So, just keeping safe and not doing anything is not generally an example of not trusting God. There's an exception to that rule, I guess. If you've asked Him for advice and direction and you haven't received it, what do you do in the meantime? Wait. Yeah. Who's good at doing that? Do I get another show of hands? Yeah. None of us are good at doing that. But that's something I've started to learn. And I'm still learning it. And I hope by the time I'm double my age, I've figured some of this stuff out if I get there. But how many times have we gone, Lord, I really need an answer to this? And then kind of 2 days later, it's like, oh, He hasn't told me yet, so I better make my own mind up. And we actually miss out on the blessing that God's provided for us often when we do that, or we get ourselves into other messes. See, I have this little thing that, and I could be completely wrong, don't take this as theology, but that King David and Bathsheba, if David had just looked out the window going, I shouldn't be looking at that, and gone back to something else, or indeed if he'd gone off to war like he was meant to have, he shouldn't have been back in the palace at the time. But you know what? Bathsheba's husband might have got killed anyhow. But he did everything back to front and didn't receive blessing. Now, I don't know. You can take what you want from that. But if you look at David's life, other times he waited. So he had the chance to kill King Saul plenty of times. A couple recorded. But he waited on God's timing and he received the blessing. And why are those stories in the Bible? So we can look at that and we can learn how to trust God better. And so we can either, just go, you know what, I'm just tired of waiting for an answer. Because I've learned that God always answers. He just doesn't always answer the way we want or when we want. And it's worth waiting for. I've never regretted waiting. Never regretted it. And I've regretted a lot of times when I've gone ahead of God's plan. Is trusting God the absence of doubt? True godly wisdom applied by people to their lives means trusting in spite of our doubts. And in spite of our temptation to doubt. Who's been tempted? Right? It's falling into the temptation that's the problem. Being tempted to doubt is not a deal breaker. It's trusting God in spite of our doubts. It's trusting God in spite of what we can see around us. It doesn't mean not having doubts, but instead remembering that God is bigger than our doubts. True godly wisdom applied by people to their lives means trusting in spite of the doubts and the temptation. And do what these guys did, instead of what the guys on the boat with Jonah did. Jesus and the disciples, now they didn't get everything right. And my suspicion is, in the midst of this storm, they probably did their best to row it out of it. It doesn't actually mention that in Scripture. But eventually they thought to wake up Jesus and ask for help. And I think too many of us are going through life with Jesus in the boat, but he's asleep. Now, he's probably pretending to be asleep, right? I don't know that he's really getting Z's. He's just got his eyes shut going, how long are they going to fight this before they ask for help? But eventually the disciples woke Jesus up. Ask God for help. So they came and roused him. Sir, help, we're about to die. He said to them, why are you afraid? So little trust you have. Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and there was a dead calm. The men were astounded. They asked, what kind of man is this that even the wind and waves obey him? Don't have Jesus sleeping in the boat. I have a little thing on my wall at work that I've just printed out that it's been up there for a few years, and it's mostly because I'm a really slow learner, and all it says is, don't work while God is resting. It should be the other way around, because God's way more capable at doing stuff than I am. But most of the time in my life, I'm working really hard, and God's not involved in that. He's in the back of the boat sleeping, because I haven't asked him for his help. And we would be much more able to trust God, I think, if we were asking for his help a lot more often. And I'm really intrigued by this particular thing because, okay, there's a massive storm, suddenly there's not. That's going to get you to ask some questions about who this guy is. But there's more to it. And again, it's about knowing the Scripture, helping build trust. So if you go to Psalm 107, in their trouble they cried to Adonai, and he rescued them from their distress. He silenced the storm and stilled its waves, and they rejoiced as the sea grew calm. Then he brought them safely to their desired port. Now you've got to remember, a bunch of the people on this boat with Jesus, a bunch of the disciples, they were fishermen, right? Which verses, if you're a fisherman and in danger of storms all the time, do you reckon you had memorized? Something tells me that their dad taught them this one when they were kids. And then they saw it happen. And then they really ask, who is this man? Because they knew the Torah, they knew the Psalms, they knew the Old Testament as we now see it. They knew this. This would have been a verse that would have been drilled into them as young fishermen. You're out there, a storm happens, remember this verse, God will save you. In their trouble they cried to Adonai, and he rescued them from their distress. He silenced the storms and stilled its waves, and they rejoiced as the sea grew calm. And then he brought them safely to their desired port. They recognized God in the midst of that storm. They recognized who the psalm was written about, and then they saw it happen. And we need to make sure we're reading our Bibles so we know those stories when God does it in our lives. Because it's experience that helps us trust in him. And that's why when you get to my age and older, I guess, things don't freak you out quite the same as they did when you were young. And this message this morning is part of a series on learning and building resilience. And we've got our kids camp, our holiday camp starting not this coming week, but the week after. And I have the privilege of leading and training some of the younger leaders. And that's kind of one of my jobs at camp. And we already picked the topic back in January of resilience. Because young people are really struggling with that. But as you get older, you start to learn, if you've been following God, more and more trust, and you build more and more resilience because it's through experience, right? And I've already seen the younger generation is changing because of COVID. Some of them, their anxiety levels are through the roof. Others are learning more resilience. And that's why we're going to talk about it at camp coming up. But we actually need to build that same thing into our lives. You know, God is training us for a purpose. A purpose while we're here on earth and a purpose in heaven. And that's, we're just basically in a 70 to 80 year, 90 year, if you're Prince Philip, training course for heaven. Yeah? And, you know, we ask why an awful lot, and we don't get a whole lot of answers, but effectively that's the overall overarching reason. And we don't often understand it, and generally speaking, we don't like it, but that's what's happening. And, you know, I often pray, Lord, I know you're trying to teach me a point in this particular part of my life where it's all falling apart. Please help me to learn quickly, because I don't like it here. That's often a prayer of mine. It's not often answered. Often it's years. And sometimes I'm able to look back and go, that's what he was trying to teach me. Wow, I'm a slow learner, but yes, I needed to learn it. And this is part of learning to trust in God. It's part of learning that resilience. There was a man who needed healing, and Jesus said to him, "What do you mean, if I can?" Because the man said, "If you can heal me." And Jesus' response was, "What do you mean, if I can?" See, he didn't really know who this person was standing in front of him. But we have the Bible to explain that to us. Maybe we need a reminder, though. That he says, everything is possible to someone who has trust. Instantly, the father of the child exclaimed, "I do trust. Help my lack of trust," as he brought his child to be healed. We need to go to God and ask him to help us with our lack of trust. It's a gift. It's not earned. It can't be learned, but it's a gift. Ask for more. If you don't have enough of something, ask for more. God didn't chastise him for asking for more. You know, some versions say faith. He didn't chastise him. He healed his son. Ask for more. In Luke 5:12, we find this story. In one of the villages, Jesus met a man with an advanced case of leprosy. When the man saw Jesus, he bowed his head as was face to the ground, begging to be healed. "Lord," he said, "if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean." And this is another thing that I struggle with. See, some people struggle with if God can, and other people struggle with if God will. And sometimes the answer is no. And that's where our resilience needs to come in. But, you know, on the bulk of times, Jesus is willing. We know he can, but he's also willing. And, you know, this is where I really struggle with my own faith walk and my own trust in God. Because I know he can, but does he want to? Well, he wants to when it's good for us, that's for sure. And if he's not, then there's a lesson that he's trying to teach us instead. Jesus answered, "I am willing, be healed." You know, our walk with God doesn't have an end point. For those who are into the details, they'll probably notice that I've been using a couple of different versions of the Bible during this message. This is from the one that sits beside my bed. I don't normally preach from it. It's from a complete Jewish Bible. And a few of the other readings have been as well. But I like it because it picks up a lot of the Jewish flavour that's often lost in English translations. And so I'm sure you've heard this message before, Matthew 7:7-8. But it normally reads, ask, and it will be given to you. But the more correct translation is, keep asking, and it will be given to you. Keep seeking, and you will find. Keep knocking, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who keeps asking receives. He who keeps seeking finds. And to him who keeps knocking, the door will be opened. And that's where we're going to end this morning. If you're looking for trust and struggling, then just keep asking. Keep knocking. Keep seeking. Keep looking. And God will give it to you. Just be aware though, don't let this put you off. But if you're asking God to teach you how to trust, well, you can probably figure out what's happening next. Life doesn't always go easily, but it goes the best that it can. Don't ask for patience unless you want to be tested. But I think we do. If we want to move on with God, keep asking. Keep trusting, keep seeking. Don't be put off when you doubt, but trust in the midst of doubt. And we've got one more song to end.